Good morning again. My name is Clint. We're glad you're here with us this morning. We don't have Polish translation today, but I believe we have, is Sasha here? Sasha somewhere? Yeah? So I think we have Russian translation for you this morning. And we're glad you're here with us today. Well, a long time ago, back when I was in seminary, when I was in school, I had a pickup truck. And pickup trucks, I've noticed, aren't as common here in Poland as they are where I'm from. Back where I'm from, there's a lot of pickup trucks. You can see them everywhere. And having a pickup truck is a blessing, but also having a pickup truck can be a curse. It's a blessing because you have this extra space in the back of the car to store things, to put things. But it can be a curse because anytime someone moves or changes their flat or their home, they call you because you have a pickup truck. The guy with the Volkswagen Golf probably doesn't get so many calls. But anyway, so I would help some friends move from time to time. And one day this friend from school asked me to help him move. He was a good friend, so I was happy to help. And the flat he was moving into was on the second level, on the second floor, but there was no elevator, which wasn't a problem. We helped, move a lot of those things up. Everything was fine until we had to move his exercise machine. So this was one of those exercise machines where you put the pin on the weight you want, right? So all the weight is there. And when you're working out, when you're pulling it over, you're only pulling a little bit. But when you're pushing this thing up, you feel all the weight. So we start to get this exercise machine up the stairs, and it's heavy. But we're going step by step by step, slowly. But there was this one moment when I felt the exercise machine start to lean on me. For some reason, I was the one under it, and my friend was, on top. He was upstairs. But anyway, it starts to lean towards me, and I start to feel all of the weight of this machine. And I just thought, okay, this is it. This is how I die. I'm just going to get crushed, by this exercise machine, which wouldn't have been so bad, except I never saw my friend use this exercise machine. Not once. It just sat in his old place. But anyway, so I'm there under the machine. I don't know how long I'm holding this exercise machine, but it felt like forever. Maybe it was only 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I had all of that weight from that machine on me, and I felt like I was going to be crushed. Have you ever felt that way in life, where everything is dependent on you? There's no one else there to help, and you're carrying everything by yourself. You're carrying your problems, you're carrying your difficulties, you're carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. And maybe you could manage it for a little while, maybe you could hold it for a moment, but pretty soon, it's going to crush you. Well, this morning, as we continue to look at the book of Exodus, we're going to look at 2 stories that talk about this. 2 times in which Moses was carrying a lot. He was carrying so much, indeed, it could have crushed him. But as we'll see this morning, the Lord made a way. So how did God do that? And how can that help you carry everything that's on your shoulders right now? So if you have a Bible, please turn with me to Exodus chapter 17, beginning in verse 8. Exodus chapter 17, beginning in verse 8. It says, Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek. while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. So last Sunday, we looked at the 3 tests that God gave Israel in the so-called wilderness university after escaping Egypt. We saw how Israel wasn't quite mature yet in their faith during these 3 tests, that Israel still had a lot to learn and a lot to grow in. But here in verse 8, we see that Israel is suddenly ambushed by the people of Amalek. Who are these guys? Who are the Amalekites? Well, we know from the Bible they were descendants of Isaac's son, Esau. And while there's not much mention of them before Exodus 17, they will eventually become one of Israel's biggest enemies in the rest of the Old Testament. They were nomadic people, meaning they always moved around in camps and changed locations constantly. And here they come and attack Israel at a very vulnerable moment. Israel is tired from traveling. They're, of course, weary from being without food and water for so many days. And this is when the Amalekites come and ambush them and attack them. You know, that can be often true for us, right? When we feel most spiritually attacked. Usually we don't feel so spiritually attacked when we wake up in the morning after a long night's sleep and have a good breakfast and have our morning coffee or morning tea. That's not usually when we feel spiritually vulnerable. Rather, it's typically when we've had a long day, maybe things during that day didn't go the way we wanted to, and we're tired, and we're wearied, and suddenly we're sort of ambushed by temptation. We don't expect it, but it comes. Sometimes it comes furiously. So what do you do in those moments? Do you just admit defeat and say, yeah, I'm too tired to fight this today? Or do we fight? Well, when it came to the physical battle that day, Israel fought. Moses tells Joshua, the same Joshua who will eventually, lead Israel into the promised land later, to gather some men and fight. And Moses said he's going to go stand on a hill with the staff that God gave him way back in chapter 4. We don't know exactly why yet, but Aaron and Hur are going to join Moses on that hill. Verse 11. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him. And he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. This is one of my favorite images from the Bible. Moses is up on this hill while Joshua and the men are down fighting with the Amalekites. And it says here that whenever, Moses lifted his hand with the staff, that Israel would win. But whenever his hand came down, the other team would start to win. The Amalekites would start to prevail. So the victory of the battle we see here depends on Moses' hand, whether it's up or down. If it's up, they're winning. If it's down, the Amalekites are winning. So what can we say about this? What can we say about Moses' hand? Well, some people say that Moses lifting his hand means that Moses was praying to God. So when his hand is up, he's in prayer. He's asking the Lord to give them victory. And when his hand comes down, that means he stopped praying, and therefore the Amalekites began to prevail. Now, I don't know if he was praying or not, but either way, I think the raised hands show that Moses knew that the victory was only going to come from God's power, that the battle indeed belonged to the Lord. So yes, Joshua, the Israelites, they're on the battlefield, they're fighting, but it was God's power, like always, that was going to give them victory. Which leads me to my first point, and that is simply, we must rely on God's power in the battle. We must rely on God's power in the battle. Again, this is a physical battle, but it's a great picture of the spiritual battles that we face in our lives. If you're engaged in that spiritual battle and you're trying to fight that battle all by yourself, most likely you're going to lose. And the reason is that God never intended you to fight that battle all by yourself. God never intended for you to carry it all on your own. Ephesians chapter 6, which is all about our spiritual battles, begins that section by saying, if you look at me at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 and 11, on the part that talks about the armor of God. Verse 10, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Paul says here, be strong in the Lord. Don't be strong in yourself. Be strong in God's might, in your own power. Then he goes on to say, put on the armor of God so that you can stand firm. If you're trying to fight your spiritual battles in your own power, you're going to lose. We see here, if you depend on the Lord like Moses did against the Amalekites, God can give you the victory. Of course, we sing about this a lot in a song we sing quite a bit here. Let's sing this together. Where's that E minor? Let's sing this. The weapon may be formed, but it won't prosper. When the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph. My God will never fail. My God, and oh, my God will never fail. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. A song we sing a lot. Question is, do we believe it? Do we practice it? Do we really believe that the battle belongs to the Lord? Or are you trying to fight that battle all by yourself? You know, in this story, Moses, we see here, is the mediator between God and Israel. He intercedes for them. And for us today, Jesus Christ is our mediator. He intercedes for us. He prays for us. He has defeated sin and death once for all on the cross. The Bible says, greater is Jesus that is in us than he that is in the world. Let me ask you this morning, as you are fighting the spiritual battles in your life today, are you fighting with your hands raised? Are you depending on the Lord? Are you trusting that Jesus already won the battle? Or are your hands down, your head down, and you're just trying to fight it by yourself? You know, another beautiful image we see here in chapter 17, you know, Moses was interceding for Israel, but Moses, after all, was just a man. He was a prophet, but he was just a man. He wasn't divine like Jesus. And because Moses was a man, he got tired. He got tired of holding his hands up. He got tired of standing. So Aaron and Hur, they give him a stone to sit on. And then what do? One gets on each side of them, and they help hold Moses' hands up. And it says here they did this the whole day until the sun went down and Israel overwhelmed the Amalekites. You know, what a great picture of the Christian life. Yes, we are utterly dependent on God for everything. It's God who gives us the victory. But God designed us in such a way that we also need the help and the support of his people. We need the Lord and we need each other. The Christian life is not some individualistic solo activity. The Christian life was meant to be lived in community. We were designed to be there for one another, to pray for one another, to support one another, to encourage one another, to lift each other up when we get tired. In other words, you weren't designed to carry everything by yourself. You weren't designed to go through this life alone. The Bible tells us to bear one another's burdens, to help each other carry the problems and the pain and the heaviness of this life. If you try to carry it by yourself, just like me with that exercise machine, you're going to get crushed. You know, today we live in such a individualistic society that tells us to just focus on yourself. So only you can make yourself happy. There's self-help books. People say the answer is inside of you. You need to find yourself. It's all about you, you, you. But the Bible tells us something different. The Bible tells us that true joy comes from knowing Christ, and that real, full, abundant life is lived in the community of his people. You know, let me ask you this morning, just for you to think about in your own mind. What are you carrying right now? What problems and difficulties are you going through today? And related to that question, is there anybody in your life who knows what you're going through? Is there anyone local that knows your pain and your hurt right now? You know, maybe your family or friends back home or wherever, they know what's going on, and that's okay. But is there anyone local, is there anyone in this church who's helping you bear your burdens right now? You know, it's great that we have the possibility to stay in touch with people from back home because of technology. Certainly in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul stayed in touch with churches by writing letters. But at the end of Paul's letters, we always read that there was someone with him, sometimes more than one person, that was there with him locally. You see, Barnabas, Silas, Tychicus, Timothy, Luke, Demas, and more. Let me ask you this morning, who do you have locally that is helping you hold your hands up? And in the same way, who locally are you helping hold their hands up? Who do you call to check on, to see how they're doing? Who do you hold in prayer? So you might say, okay, all this sounds good. I should be a part of the community, but where do I start? Maybe you're here, you look around, and you see a lot of people, and you say, this is kind of intimidating. How do I even become part of this community? And there's always two easy ways for you to become a part, and that is to serve and to grow. You can serve in one of our existing ministries, or you could join one of the Bible studies that are going. Just start small. But I would also say to you, be patient. Community isn't built in a day. Community takes time to form. You know, I've been learning this myself in the past few weeks. So my son, Connor, started primary school this semester. And so, you know, in the beginning, there's a lot of meetings with parents. And so at these meetings, there's a bunch of other dads, and I don't really know them. They seem to already know each other. But I would greet them and say hello, but, you know, I kind of felt like an outsider. But one night when the kids were away for like an overnight, all the parents met at this restaurant. And I went, my wife stayed at home with our other kids. And so I go there, and I only know one other person. And I walk in, and everybody's there laughing, having a good time. There's like 20 or 30 people. And I have this thought of like, I could easily just, you know, go home. No one would see me, and I could just say, oh, you know, I was tired. I was busy. But I was like, okay, I'm here. Even though it's a bit awkward, I'm going to sit down and start chatting. So I was sitting with a bunch of the dads, and at the same time, there was a basketball game on TV. And some of the guys were into the game, so we started talking about basketball. And the next week, one of those dads reached out to me and said, hey, we're going to start playing basketball on Thursday nights. Would I like to join? And I hadn't played basketball in years. I wasn't sure if my legs still worked or what. But I love playing basketball, and I saw it as an opportunity. And I said, yes, absolutely, I will join. So the past few weeks on Thursday nights, I've been playing basketball with these other dads. And honestly, it's one of the best parts of my week. It's so much fun. And when we're playing, we're bonding, right? We're not telling each other our life stories yet. But whenever I pick up my son from school now, I kind of know a few of the other dads. We greet each other. We say, hey, how are you doing? These are all guys I didn't know 2 months ago. My point is that community takes time to build, but you also have to be willing to put yourself in situations that might be awkward at first. I would have never found out about the basketball game if I didn't go to the restaurant that night. But I did. And because of that, I'm seeing these guys every week. And yes, of course, communities can be such a blessing, but we also know that communities can also cause us the most pain because we're broken people that God is redeeming and sanctifying, so it's never perfect. But despite all that, truth is, we need each other. Our hands, our arms are going to get tired. And we need each other to help lift us up in those moments of weakness. Verse 14, Exodus chapter 17, verse 14 through 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, the Lord is my banner, saying, a hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So God tells Moses to remember what he did that day, how he gave victory to Israel over the Amalekites. It doesn't say why God's judgment on Amalek was so severe. But as I said, we see in the rest of the Old Testament that they continue to be enemies of Israel. But on this day, Israel prevailed. So Moses builds an altar and calls it, the Lord is my banner. It was God who gave Israel the victory that day, and Moses and Israel didn't want to forget it. Chapter 18, verse 1. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he sent her home along with her 2 sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. The story shifts from the battlefield to the family. Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro, meet again. So we met Jethro way back earlier in Exodus 2 when Moses was running from Pharaoh after killing the Egyptian. Jethro invited Moses in, eventually gives Moses his daughter Zipporah to marry. And we know that Moses was a shepherd for Jethro for almost 40 years before God told him to leave and deliver his people from slavery from Egypt. So the two of them probably hadn't seen each other since the day Moses left for Egypt. So Jethro comes with Moses' wife, his 2 sons. Maybe Moses had sent them back there for safety reasons. But they come and they meet Moses in the wilderness. Verse 6. And when he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went in the tent. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done in Israel, and that he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. So Jethro comes, Moses goes out to greet him, and they embrace. They go inside the tent to catch up. And the atmosphere here is just really warm. You can read it. You know, at this point, Moses is a famous man. He's a great man. He's done many things. But here we still see him honoring his father-in-law. You know, I don't even have to tell you this, but for those of y'all who are married, we know that some of the most difficult relationships for a husband and a wife can be the other person's parents, the in-laws, right? Many conflicts can come from these relationships because there's so many dynamics in these relationships. Maybe the mom feels threatened by the new wife. Maybe the father feels like the new husband isn't good enough for his daughter. Maybe the parents have a different idea about how the husband and wife should raise their children, and on and on. I'm sure every married person in here has a story to tell about their father or mother-in-law. But I think we can take something from this story about how Moses treats his father-in-law Jethro with respect and honor, even when perhaps we feel like our parents-in-law don't deserve it. So Moses and Jethro catch up. Moses tells him the story about getting out of Israel. He tells Jethro all that God has done, the good parts, also the hard parts, he says. And when Jethro hears the story, he rejoices. Verse 10, Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people." And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Jethro says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord, and that the Lord is greater than any other gods." Now, there is some debate about Jethro. Some people say in these verses we see the conversion of Jethro. We know that Jethro was a priest of Midian, but was he a priest of God, of the Lord, or was he a priest of pagan gods? So those that say he was a priest to the pagan gods would say that this is when Jethro became a believer in Yahweh, in the Lord. This is the context of his statement when he says, wow, God is greater than all the other gods. But other people would say that he wasn't a priest to the pagans, because when he's first mentioned in Exodus, he's called Ruel, which means friend of God. So they would say he already knew God. He was a friend of God. Frankly, I don't know which interpretation is better, but I do think there are things we can learn from this story about engaging our family members, especially older family members, with the gospel. First of all, Moses engages Jethro with respect. He didn't talk down to him. He didn't shame him, but he honored him. Right? It's really easy to just say the truth or speak the truth. What's more difficult is to speak the truth with love. And we see here that Moses had a lot of love for his father-in-law. Secondly, Moses tells Jethro the story of what God has done in his life. He tells him the good parts and the hard parts. And that leads me to my second point this morning, and that is we must tell others the story of what God has done. We must tell others the story of what God has done. You know, it's not very complicated. Sometimes when it comes to talking to family members about what we believe, we can complicate it and we can think that we need to have all these answers. But if we pray and simply tell people about who God is and what he's done, it's amazing what the Lord can do. You know, it reminds me of a story that my dad told me about him and his grandfather, which would be my great-grandfather. So today my dad is in that phase of life where he's writing some of his stories down from his life, which I appreciate. So he sent me this story a few weeks ago. So instead of me telling the story in my own words, let me just read the words of my father. He says, "My grandmother was a Christian, but my grandfather didn't go to church. My grandfather had emphysema and was very limited in getting around all the time that I had known him. Simply walking 6 meters would make him tired, and he would have to stop and catch his breath. But despite this, he was very active on his farm. He was driving tractors and driving in his truck as he collected the cantaloupes, watermelons, and cotton that he farmed. From the time I was 9 years old, I would spend several weeks each summer living with my grandparents and helping them with the cantaloupes and watermelons. I became very close to my grandfather. From a very early age, I was always concerned about him and prayed for him a lot. I guess I was afraid to talk to him about God, so I just prayed and worried for him. One summer when I was 12 years old, I got enough courage to read the Bible to my grandfather. We were sitting in the living room by ourselves while my grandmother was preparing dinner, and I had my Bible, and I just started reading from Mark chapter 4, which is the parable of the soils. We didn't talk about it. I think he was very surprised that I had read the Bible to him, and I read the Bible to him 2 more times after that. But later on that week, I picked up a virus that was going around, and I got pretty sick. I had a high fever, and I woke up in the middle of the night and ran outside and vomited. My grandmother helped clean me up, and she gave me some medicine. So I just sat outside resting, and my grandfather came out and sat with me. I told him I didn't want him to go to hell, and that I was worried for him. He told me that I shouldn't worry about him and that he would straighten up one day. I said, "Grandfather, you're not going to live forever, and you need to become a Christian." That's about all that was said that night. At the time, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to lead him to the Lord, but I think that he was so touched that his young grandson had so much concern for him that he finally got serious with God. The next Sunday was very different than any other Sunday in their home. My parents had come that weekend to bring me home, back to their home. And on Sunday morning, we all went to church. I know that my grandfather had a hard time to physically walk up all the steps to the church, but he did. He came forward at the invitation and gave his life to Christ. A few weeks later, he was baptized. He thanked me later for helping him get himself straightened out with the Lord, and I'm looking forward to seeing him in heaven one day. God had actually used me in a small way in the salvation of my grandfather, even before I was a Christian myself. That story always touches me because there's something so simple about it, right? I know that many of you have family members that you long to see know Christ. Some of you have been praying for years and years and years. I'm reminded of the story that Joshua tells about, it's your grandmother, right? You prayed for 25 years? 20 years, 25 years. Yeah. Before knowing the Lord. My point is this: keep praying. Keep asking God for opportunities. Speak the truth in love, because it's not over until it's over. Ultimately, it's God who changes the hearts of our family members. But may we be faithful in the telling the story of all that God's done, the good things that have happened and the hard things that have happened, just like Moses. Verse 13. The next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw that what he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to Jethro, because the people have come to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his law. So it's the next day. Jethro is still with Moses, and Moses takes his father-in-law to work with him. Jethro sees a day in the life of Moses at work. And from morning to night, Moses is there judging the people as they ask what God would want them to do in certain situations. So when there's a problem between two people, they come to Moses. Moses says what God would say about the problem and how it should be resolved. Remember, this is the days before everyone had the Bible on their phone, right? This was even before the 10 Commandments were written down. So the only way that people had access to God's word was through Moses, the prophet, the mediator. That was the system that day. But as we'll see, Jethro didn't quite understand it. Verse 17, Jethro said to him, "What you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for this thing is too heavy for you. You're not able to do it alone. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them known the way in which they must walk and they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, who hate bribes, and place such men as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they should decide themselves. So it would be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you, you'll be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place and peace." Jethro goes with Moses to work. He watches him work. He looks at the system and says, "Moses, this isn't good. Moses, this isn't sustainable. This system will make you exhausted. This system is too much for you to carry by yourself. Moses, this system is going to crush you. You can't do this alone." Now, of course, Moses was doing good work. He was doing important work. But as long as it was just him, it wasn't going to be sustainable. It wasn't good for him, and it wasn't going to be good for the people. He was going to get crushed. And that leads me to my last point this morning, which is simply, we must serve the Lord in a sustainable way. We must serve God in a sustainable way for the long haul. This is an important lesson for all of us when it comes to ministry. You can be doing good things for the Lord, great things for the Lord, important things for the Lord. But if it's all dependent on you, eventually that ministry is going to become a burden, and that burden will indeed crush you. I've had to learn this lesson a few times in my life. When everything is working fine in this system, it works. But when the load becomes too much, that's when it becomes simply too tough. Ministry is meant to be shared. You know, I believe that team-based ministry is the best approach. We see this principle in the New Testament as well. In Acts chapter 6, the church was increasing in size, but the apostles were still doing a lot of the main work. And because of that, the widows were being neglected. And so they installed the advice of Jethro. They found people who had good character and trusted the ministry to them so that they could focus on praying, preaching, and teaching. That kind of ministry can actually multiply. But the key thing we see here in Exodus 18, and we also see in Acts 6, is not to give responsibility to people who aren't ready, because that would just make it worse, but to give responsibility to people who are trustworthy, who have good character, and who love the Lord. Also, Jethro tells Moses, stay involved. When it comes to the harder cases, they should come to you. And Jethro says, look, God will lead you. God will direct you. And you will be able to succeed and endure this ministry because other people are bearing the burden with you. This is wisdom. This is great advice. But what will Moses say? Will he say, thanks, father-in-law, but why don't you go back to your sheep on your farm? Or will Moses receive it? Last verses, verse 24. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. Moses chose able men of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. Moses didn't reject Jethro's advice, he received it. He implements the plan, and Jethro goes back home. And we see in this visit that both Moses and Jethro were blessed. Jethro was blessed by hearing of what God did in delivering Israel from Egypt. And Moses was blessed by this organizational advice from his father-in-law. You know, I didn't finish my story at the beginning with me and the exercise machine. But after those 2 seconds in which I felt, I don't know how much weight it was, when I just felt all of that weight on me and I thought that was it, I thought I was going to die, someone else happened to be walking up the stairs at that moment, and he pushed the machine back up the stair with me and took the load off of me. And it was amazing how much easier it was to carry that machine with someone helping me. My point is this morning, don't try to do this life all by yourself. It's too heavy. You're going to get crushed. Instead, rely on the Lord. The battle belongs to Him. And rely on each other. The Bible says, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Pray for one another. Be there for one another. Let's lift one another's arms up. May we not do ministry as individuals, but as teams. We need the Lord, and we need each other. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward and lead us in a song of response. And I'll be over here in the front to pray with you. And I invite you to come forward this morning. You know, maybe this morning you're realizing that you're just carrying the load of this life all by yourself. And it's too heavy. And this morning God is telling you, look, I never intended for you to carry this all by yourself. I intended to fight this battle for you and for you to share this burden with others. I invite you to come and pray. Maybe this morning you want to pray for a family member who doesn't know Jesus Christ as Lord yet. Maybe today you're like my great-grandfather, and you're sitting here today, God's working in your heart, and you want to know, what is this life? What does it mean to follow Jesus? And you don't quite know what it is, but God's working in your heart, and He wants you to pursue that. I would love to talk more about that with you, to pray with you. I invite you to come this morning. Maybe this morning God is leading to you to that next step of getting baptized. We're going to have a baptism service in January. And maybe God is putting it on your heart to take that next step of faith. I invite you to come. Or maybe it's something else. Whatever God has put on your heart this morning, I invite you to come. Don't carry all of this stuff on your own. Let me pray for us. Father God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the lives of Moses and Jethro. God, may we learn from their wisdom here, God, how the battle belongs to you and how we need to depend on you for all things. God, we confess it's so easy to try to go through this life all by ourselves and carry these things all in our